This week's topic wasn't on our immediate agenda until last Saturday, when a man with a rifle opened fire in a residential neighborhood of Kyiv. The 58-year-old Moscow-born shooter killed 7 people and injured 14 more, several of whom he held hostage in a grocery store. Although law enforcement eventually stormed the store and took out the gunman, video from earlier in the rampage showed that officers called to the scene had failed to respond, instead running away in panic from the shooter. The head of the patrol police resigned on Monday over his staff's disjointed response to the shooting, but that's done little to quell public anxieties and renewed debates about how Ukraine should approach the issue of gun control, as more people than ever own and operate firearms due to the war. I'm Belokur, reporting to you from Kyiv, and this week we're going to look at both sides of the debate. Does Ukraine need stricter gun control, or more liberal policies? And what are the government's options for regulation at this point in the war, when thousands of civilians and military personnel own guns and might not be willing to give them up? Starting at square one. How easy is it to get a gun in Ukraine? The official answer is that civilians can own hunting and sporting rifles for recreational purposes, if they successfully acquire a license and store the weapon properly. Ukraine is actually the only country in Europe without comprehensive gun control laws, and the Interior Ministry reserves the subjective authority to grant or deny any citizen a gun license, a process that's been criticized for decades as both overly conservative and ripe for corruption. And again, this only pertains to civilians owning rifles. No one except soldiers, security guards, and certain government officials is legally allowed to own a handgun. Prior to the full-scale invasion, the Interior Ministry recorded approximately 1.2 million legal firearms in Ukraine. However, official records don't always reflect reality. Ukraine has historically ranked first in Europe for its ratio of illegally to legally owned firearms, with the 2023 survey by the Agency for Legislative Initiatives finding that just 45% of respondents reported that their guns were legally registered. There's a disparity between official and unofficial gun numbers everywhere, but there are some historical factors that have exacerbated this in Ukraine even before Russia's invasion. Under Soviet control, Ukraine was both a weapons manufacturer and a stockyard. When it gained independence in 1991, those massive stockpiles were sold and distributed via official and unofficial channels. We'll ultimately never know where a lot of it ended up. There's also a long history of Ukrainian officials skirting license rules by gifting each other guns, through this loophole that says it's not an illegal weapon if it's presented as a state award. And although exact numbers can't be calculated across the entire government, records show that thousands of firearms have been distributed this way since 1991. Ukraine might have a shortage of laws around guns, but it's certainly never had a shortage of guns. And then you add in the Russian invasion. Now, let's just stick to civilians for a moment. There was an uptick in people trying to buy guns through both official and unofficial channels after Russia's 2014 invasion, as well as a trickle-down ownership of military-issued guns. In 2018, the midway point between Russia's first invasion and the start of the full-scale war, it was estimated that there were around 4.4 million civilian-owned guns in Ukraine, which included both registered and unregistered weapons. When the full-scale invasion began in February of 2022, Ukrainian authorities handed out more than 25,000 automatic rifles and other weapons to volunteers in Kyiv and other cities, many of which were never recovered. By 2023, the Swiss-based Small Arms Survey found that 6.7% of Ukrainian respondents self-reported having a gun in their home. And then using a model that's been used to calculate gun ownership in Latin America, that same survey estimated that up to 11% of total Ukrainian households may now be armed either legally or illegally, with Ukrainian lawmaker Alexander Danutsa warning at the end of 2025 that overall illegal gun ownership has more than tripled since the start of the full-scale invasion. Now, we also have to address the fact that hundreds of thousands of gun owners in Ukraine aren't civilians. They're soldiers, and subject to very different protocols and regulations. Now, just to give you a sense of scope, when Ukraine gained independence in 1991, its armed forces contained about 800,000 enlisted soldiers. And that number shrank to less than a fifth over the following 2 decades. When Russia invaded in 2014, the military grew to over 200,000 personnel and stayed in that range until 2022, when it ballooned back up to pre-independence numbers in under a year. And as of 2026, there are around 1 million enlisted personnel. And it's okay if you're not following this exactly. I'm just trying to illustrate that Ukraine's military has undergone wild fluctuations in size and structure in the last 3 decades. And tracking inventory has probably been far less of a priority than defending against the invader. Many veterans have taken guns home with them at the end of their service, or specialists like snipers might crowdfund to buy a better quality gun, which then belongs to them, not the military. Whether a soldier is authorized to permanently take a weapon home or not, in practice, it happens. And when you consider the size of the impending veteran population after a ceasefire, the difficulty of asking them all to disarm becomes clear. With all of that being said, even though unregulated firearms have been an uneasy presence in Ukraine since its independence, incidents like last week's mass shooting are historically really rare here. A man shot 3 security guards at a mall in Kyiv in 2012, and a gunman killed 5 people at a factory in Dnipro in January of 2022. And these are really the only comparable incidents of mass civilian gun violence in modern Ukraine. Last weekend's shooting and the failure of the police to counter the gunmen effectively has reignited the debate on how Ukraine should approach gun control at this juncture. Because as simple as it is to say that fewer guns equals fewer shootings, Ukraine is not on track to have fewer guns. So what, then, is the alternative? Before we move on, I'd like to bring your attention to a segment that we do every week towards the end of the show, the member question. Have you ever wondered where that comes from? Well, I'm here to tell you. When you become a member of the Kyiv Independent community, you get access to a bunch of members-only content and resources, and one of them is the Kyiv Independent Discord server. There's a channel there dedicated to this show where I share the topic early in the week and you guys come up with the questions. If you'd like to join in, please consider becoming a member of our community. There will be a link to a page with more information below. One of the primary arguments for more liberal gun ownership in Ukraine after last week's mass shooting echoes a common refrain in the American gun debate, that giving law-abiding citizens guns reduces overall crime. The National Rifle Association states unequivocally on their website that criminals are deterred when they believe that their victims are armed, and thus, guns bring down crime rates. And when it comes to last week, the fact that the police called to the scene completely failed to neutralize the shooter promptly, which allowed him to harm more people, does make one think that maybe in an alternate universe, a well-positioned Good Samaritan with a handgun could have saved lives. And when you think of how many Ukrainians are gun-savvy now, it's extra frustrating to watch this video of the police running away from the shooter. Unsurprisingly, some of the most vocal proponents of liberalizing gun laws in Ukraine are the serving military members and veterans. And there's an undeniable conceit in asking people who've sacrificed their lives for their country, who you've entrusted to use lethal weapons, to then be asked to revert to being unarmed again. With no ceasefire in sight, and re-invasion all but inevitable unless Ukraine receives meaningful security guarantees, you can fully understand why a Ukrainian service person reserves the right to keep their weapon. There's also the argument that bans don't make guns disappear, they just make them harder to regulate. And even those most staunchly opposed to gun ownership in Ukraine have to admit that the problem is here to stay, and there likely won't be a mass surrender of weapons if regulations are tightened. Rather, legislation needs to meet Ukrainians where they are, and account for what's likely to come. Warfare is part of Ukrainian education at this point, and gun safety goes hand in hand with other kinds of awareness. When the war ends, if Russia still exists in its current form, Ukraine will retain a permanent defensive posture. The war between the Soviet Union and Finland has been over for 80 years, but Finland still has mandatory military service and consistently ranks in the top 3 countries in Europe for highest gun ownership per capita. That's the future Ukraine is looking at. The threat from Russia will never go away. And while a heavily armed population is likely to experience higher rates of gun violence, it's also much more of a deterrent to an invader than an unarmed and unsavvy population. As the saying goes, those who live by the sword get shot by those who don't. But rather than just telling you about gun culture in Ukraine, we decided to show you.
I think it's very important because we don't know how the current war activities are going to develop. I believe that every man in Ukraine is supposed to be ready to take a fight. Obviously, you have a bunch of serving officers here from the military. You also have some reservists. You also have some hobbyists. So I think not only for men but also for women. We see a bunch of women here today. I think these are great skills to have in your sort of arsenal to then use potentially later on.
Стосовно зброї, певно, я почала десь з 2010 року, тому що я військова. Так, але саме спортом почала так активно займатися в 2020-му. Тому що це розвиток, володіти зброєю – це дуже круто, і особливо, чому саме спорт, тому що тут максимально йде увага на безпеку, на швидкість та влучність. Я вважаю, що всі повинні вміти володіти зброєю, особливо ті, які мають, наприклад, нагородну зброю, або є якийсь вільний доступ, наприклад, в тирі приходять. І це той навик, який ніколи не буде зайвим.
Дуже суттєво зросла зацікавленість зброї. З'явилася нова навіть така в нас улюблена категорія відвідувачів стрільбищ – це сім'ї. Це коли тато, мама, двійко дітей приїжджають сюди там, в суботу, в неділю і проводять тут кілька годин, займаючись стрільбою. Це прям от кайф, це приємно бачити. У нас до повномасштабки працювала дитяча секція. Хто займався в дитячій секції? На 90% це були діти наших спортсменів. Спортсмени приїздили на свої тренування, привозили дітей, діти займалися з окремим тренером, батьки займалися своїм. То зараз, от, після повномасштабки, це прям взагалі окрема категорія відвідувачів стрільбищ, коли там батько привозить всю сім'ю і вони тренуються, займаються разом. Я однозначно виступаю за. Я виступаю за легалізацію короткоствольної зброї для цивільного володіння, оскільки це зброя самозахисту, бо ми маємо трошки такий неадекватний перекос. Українцям дозволено купувати як мисливську зброю, зброю великих калібрів, зброю для стрільби на дальню дистанцію, але при цьому заборонено мати зброю самооборони. Ну абсурд. Тим більше це загальна нормальна, загальноєвропейська практика. Просто потрібно розробити програму курсів, програму підготовки для майбутніх власників короткоствольної зброї і дозволити самооборонятися. Це нормально.
I started shooting when I was young guy. My uncle, he was military and he took me to hunting. I bought my first gun when I was 21. Now I'm 33 and I still shooting different guns. It's rifles, it's handguns, the shotguns. Yeah, I found that like more friends still start interested in shooting and they want to teach how to shoot. They interested in the rules, the safety. They're telling me like, hey, Zhenya, let's go to the range, teach how to shoot a handgun as well a rifle. And some of them started going to buy the guns and start shooting. I like that because for me it's like new people understand what is gun, how to operate with that. They understand what is safety. They understand that it's like not so easy like in the movies. Unfortunately, you're right. We have no the correct law regulating this point. In my opinion, we should have because it's our safety and you first person who relates for your safety. And as we know, the police comes to the criminal place when it happened, and we need to protect ourselves first.
It was, I think, my childhood dream to shoot from big guns because I started my career in shooting sport as a shotgun shooter. Many sportsmen, many guys who shoot great and many masters went to war. They now in Ukrainian forces protect Ukraine from aggressor, from Russian aggression, and it's really impact not from the good side. Many range officers we lost. I mean, we not lost as a human, but we lost as a sportsmen. So, sportsmen and range officers because they leave our sport to protect our Ukraine.
До повномасштабної війни я зовсім не тримав зброю у руцях. З 22-го року це 5-й рік. В цей час, і не тільки в Україні, володити зброєю – це must have, так же як і медицина. По-перше, кожна людина повинна мати право на самозахист. От ми зараз у стрілковому клубі Firearms проговорюємо і готуємо документи до Міністерства поліції. Вважаємо, що короткий ствол должен вводитися поступово. Суспільство должно розуміти, що просто дати дозвіл на зброю – це мало. Тому що у нас закони треба міняти, тому що толку від цієї зброї, коли до мене до хати вривається там бандит, і я не можу примінити, тому що я получу вирок, да, там, ну, нема захищення. Право власності, право життя – це за перше в будь-якої конституції, а у нас це не працює.
The arguments against liberalizing gun laws in Ukraine are largely the same as in the rest of the world. Guns account for 75% of homicides globally, and frequency of crimes correlates directly to how many guns are readily available in a given geographic locale. Countries and individual regions with looser gun laws have significantly higher rates of gun related homicides, suicides, and accidents than places with stricter laws. A 2020 study by Stanford University found that men who own guns are 8 times more likely to commit suicide, and women who own guns are 35 times more likely. Studies dating back to the 90s have found that cohabitating with someone who owns a handgun increases the risk of dying by homicide twofold. This has been proven empirically many times. More guns on hand means more guns being shot. If Ukraine has experienced only a small handful of mass shootings in the last couple of decades, this past weekend could be a grim omen of more to come. Because as I keep saying, the guns aren't going anywhere anytime soon. And it's not just Ukraine that needs to be worried about where its guns end up. In the aftermath of the Yugoslav wars of the 90s, millions of guns went unaccounted for, and many made their way out of the Balkans and across continents, turning up in conflicts from Northern Ireland to Afghanistan. To this day, the Balkans are still heavily associated with arms trafficking, and there's heavy overlap between gun culture and organized crime, even a quarter century after the fighting ended. No one knows how many guns will be in circulation at the end of the war, because no one knows when that'll be. Any new legislation around gun ownership needs to simultaneously account for the chaos of the present moment, the reality of what future deterrence will require, and the optimism that the world can and should be made safer for everyone. And that's why this topic is so uneasy to talk about now. Last week's mass shooting was shocking and tragic, but it's taking place in the context of Russia committing mass shootings against all of Ukraine for years on end. People cannot just disarm while they're under attack. And likewise, there is no final authority to defer to on this matter. Gun control has never been codified into law, the military remains in charge under martial law, and the government is well aware that veterans will make up an enormous chunk of the voting population after the war is over. The government cannot afford to go head-to-head with the military, now or after a ceasefire. We spoke with someone with much more hands-on experience when it comes to this topic. Lieutenant Colonel Bogdan Kratevich, former Chief of Staff of the Azov Brigade. So to start, just broadly speaking, how do military personnel feel about the government's current policy on gun control, and how is it different for those who are currently serving versus veterans who have cycled out?
Я думаю, що насправді зараз відрізняється тільки тим, що ветерани більше долучені до лобіювання впровадження права на надання збройного самозахисту, включно з правом на володіння та носіння короткоствольної зброї, тому що у ветеранів немає цієї зброї якраз таки для самозахисту, в тому числі і для захисту навколишнього суспільства. А у військовослужбовців, поки вони на службі, ну, зброя є. Тобто це єдина різниця. Але обидва соціального кола, вони, звичайно, всі, ну, в більшості за те, щоб було контрольоване, жорстоке, але право на придбання короткоствольної зброї, носіння з метою самозахисту.
From that perspective, what could changed, more liberal gun laws in Ukraine look like? How could that kind of be rolled out? Like, what is sort of the goal of these lobbies?
Основне те, що не розуміють зараз насправді не українці, ніхто в нашій державі, те, що станом на зараз закон про зброю його не існує. От. Втім, в нас продаються там нарізна зброя, там гладкоствольна зброя, тобто там автомати, які стріляють одиночною стрільбою, або рушниці, помпові рушниці. От. Щоб отримати це, вам треба мати там, з 21 року продається помпова рушниця, з 25 років продається нарізна зброя. Але щоб вам це отримати, вам треба зробити насправді 3 звичайних речі. Це перше, достати десь справку від нарколога, друге справку від психіатра, і третє це пройти курс знання поводження зі зброєю, які зараз проводяться на базі там тирів. Що вам не треба робити? Вам не треба здавати жодного тесту. Тобто, якщо, я думаю, тут всі вчилися як мінімум в школі, можливо, в університеті і так далі, розуміють, що навчання недостатньо, треба здавати тест. І по факту на даний момент в нас в Україні простіше купити зброю, отримати зброю, ніж отримати посвідчення на право водіння автотранспорту. Не дивлячись на те, що наша нація, вона достатньо, скажімо так, з великою історією, то держава Україна, на жаль, вона не така стара. Дивлячись там, що Сполученим Штатам скільки років там, більше 250, якщо я не помиляюсь, так? Ми таким похвастатись не можемо. І от за 250 років там в Сполучених Штатах закони будувалися методом помилок і тестів. В нас, тобто, ми почали існувати не так давно, тому в нас є оці прогалини в закону, які треба виправити. І нам їх важче виправити, тому що в нас в країні станом на зараз йде війна. Але, звичайно, кожен українець хоче мати гарантію, як там друга поправка в Сполучених Штатах Америки, для того, щоб мати змогу захистити себе, захистити свою домівку, захистити свою сім'ю і захистити навіть там сусіда, проходящого там повз. Як ми бачили, зараз теракт в Києві відбувся. Якби там був хоч один колишній військовослужбовець або свідомий громадянин, у якого є зброя і є короткоствольна зброя, цей теракт би закінчився з 100% меншими втратами, ніж він закінчився.
The military community will only grow over time, as will the gun-literate civilian population. The time for the government to make decisions about legislation is now, not after a ceasefire. But when addressing the issue of guns in wartime, it's easy to miss the forest for the trees, to say that moderate internal measures can mitigate a massive problem that's being fueled from the outside. The best way to ensure that Ukrainians have less deadly weapons in their homes and their surroundings is to remove the omnipresent threat to their safety and existence, which necessitates the ongoing production, distribution, and use of said weapons. Everyone in Ukraine can agree that the most immediately effective form of gun control would be for the Russian military to leave and never come back. Everything after that is secondary.
Hi, I am Katerina Denisova, a reporter with the Kyiv Independent. Over the past week, we received multiple questions from our members concerning the recent mass shooting in Kyiv, so I'm here to answer one of them. Our member, Matt W., asks, would some civilians having guns make all civilians legitimate military targets? No. Civilians are not combatants, and simply owning or carrying a handgun does not make them military targets. As of now, this remains a largely theoretical discussion, as Ukraine does not have a comprehensive legislation regulating firearms circulation, defining which weapons are legal, or establishing a framework for armed self-defense. In the wake of this mass shooting, which is a rare occurrence here in Ukraine, the debate over allowing civilians to carry handguns in public for self-defense has re-emerged. But much of this current discussion is driven by emotion, and in practical terms, I think that any law regulating this issue is unlikely to be adopted in the near future, more likely over next few years, even potentially even by the next parliament. But even such a move won't turn civilians who does not participate in hostilities and just carry handguns for self-defense into military targets.
That's all for this week. We'll be back next Sunday with more news from Ukraine. If you appreciated this video, please consider becoming a member of the Kyiv Independent community. It's truly thanks to viewers like you that we can do this work, and we're so grateful for your support.